I got a very interesting and important email this past week with the subject line, "What's the deal with Midrash?" This is from my friend Joel, and he asked me, "What's the deal with Midrash?" This is a quote from the email. "I've heard it explained that Midrash is a collection of writings by rabbis who were speaking to their communities of the time as a way to use the Torah to address, quote, modern issues. But other times it seems I see that Midrash is taken just as definitive as Torah itself. For example, that Eliezer was the servant in the Chayei Sarah. Some Midrash is so outlandish that it seems it can't possibly be taken literally. And sometimes Midrash's stories conflict with one another. Sorry, I'm trying to read it accurately. And I'm fumbling over the words. And sometimes Midrash teachers conflict with one another so completely that it would be nearly impossible to believe that both are true. Is it true? Is it allegory? Is it creative writing? Is it prophecy? Is it divinely inspired? If it is divinely inspired, how do we know that? And is every Midrash equally inspired? Who decides which is and which isn't? In short, what's the deal with Midrash? I like this email. It's a well-written email and a well-constructed question. And as things had it, I was actually in the middle of creating a presentation titled, "What's Midrash?" I'm even considering, and still considering, doing like a standalone Midrash podcast. But before that, of course, you need a proper introduction to Midrash. So let's dig into Joel's question. What's the deal with Midrash? Now, to begin, let's get some definitions. What is Midrash? In our context, Midrash refers to a series of books, very ancient books that are part of the Jewish library. Of course, we have a lot of books. Most primary of them is the Torah, the actual Torah, the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moshe. These are the only works that God is the author. Very important to have that understanding. Moshe is not considered the author of the Torah. In fact, our sages tell us, if you believe that, it's actually heresy. Why? Because we believe that God is the author. Moshe is the scribe. He is transcribing the words that Hashem tells him to write, but God is the author. Every word of the Torah is from God, and Moshe is simply writing what God is telling him to write. That's one class of books. We have, of course, the prophets and the writings, our Bible, if you will, the canon of the Tanakh, 24 books. You have the 5 of the Torah, and 19 of the prophets and the writings, the Nevi'im and the Ksuvim. Now, these are also words written prophetically. These are also words written by prophets. But there's a very important distinction between the Torah, 5 books of Moshe, and the other 19 books of the canon. With the Torah, the actual words are authored by God. Moshe is just simply writing it down. Right? Bereshis. He writes Bereshis. Bara, and so on. Word for word for word, for letter for letter for letter. God tells Moshe, and Moshe writes it. When it comes to the other books of the Tanakh, the writings and the prophets, even though they're prophetic, but God does not tell the prophet the words, rather the idea, the concept. And the words of the prophet are formulated by the prophet. So there's an idea, there's a message, there's a concept that the prophet receives. And the prophet is told, go convey this to the masses, but the precise word formulation, that is the product of the prophet who delivers the message. Thus, the Talmud tells us that every prophet writes with their own style. They have their own flair of how they write it. Why do they have their style? I want the word of God, not the word of Jeremiah, Isaiah, and so on. Great people, I want the word of God. No, this is not the word of God, this is the word of the prophet. It's the ideas of God, it's the messages that the prophet received from God, but the style, that is the handiwork of the prophet. meaning the prophet receives the message, the concept, the idea, whatever they're told to convey to the people, and they have to formulate words, their own words, with their own style for how to exactly articulate the message that they received from God. So this is a very important distinction if we're going to talk about the corpus of writings that we have in our library, and we're going to talk about Midrash. We have to very much understand Torah, and then Nach, the Ta versus the Nach, the Torah versus the prophets and the writings. They're both prophetic, of course, but there's a very important difference. The Talmud says the prophetic introduction, Zeh HaDavar, this is the word of God, only Moshe says it. None of the other prophets claim to say this is the word of God. This is a message of God. This is a vision and so on. But this is not the word, the actual word of God. That's only the Torah, which is why we know, of course, we have 613 mitzvos from the Almighty. And all of those are found in writings, in books, but only in the Torah. There are 613 mitzvos in the 5 books of the Torah and 0 of the 613 in the last 19. Why? Because mitzvos that we have from the Almighty come only via this system, God to Moshe, with the precise words, and Moshe writes it down in the Torah. You may have some rabbinic ideas, rabbinic mitzvos, which is a separate subject, but the 613 mitzvos of the Torah from Hashem to Moshe, that comes in the most unadulterated and clear form of prophecy, the prophecy of Moshe. All the other prophets, they receive prophecy, and they have clarity, each on their own level, but none of it matches that of Moshe. He is the father of all the prophets. So 5 of the Torah, 19 of the prophets and the writings, and the Talmud tells us, really we should subsist with only 6. We only really need 6 books. We need the 5 of the Torah, and we need the book of Joshua, because that tells us where in the line of Israel every tribe is situated. Had the nation not sinned, they would not have received any more books. The purpose of all the other books is because we chose paths and ways of life, and we made decisions that were non-optimal. Therefore, they might send us prophets to help get us back on track, but really the Torah is the messages that we absolutely need, plus the book of Joshua. Had we not sinned, we would have only 6. And then, of course, there's the oral Torah. And we've spoken about this at length many, many times here in the Torch Center and on the podcast. There's a companion work to the written Torah, and that is the oral Torah. And only those two together can we really understand the Word of God. The Torah is written very cryptically. If you just try to follow the written Torah without knowing really how to decipher it, you'll end up doing things that are completely against the will of Hashem, and you will not conform to the will of Hashem. You have to have the oral Torah as well. And for 1,500 years, our nation perpetuated both the written Torah, the 304,005 letters of the written Torah, is actually how Moshe did it initially from God. And there was always the companion work of the oral Torah, teacher to student, parent to child, generation to generation. There came a point in history where this was no longer feasible. There was too much chaos, upheaval, dispersion, oppression. It became impossible to accurately transmit the oral Torah to the next generation. So we have the Mishnah. The Mishnah is a set of books that is the canonized version of the oral Torah, or part of it. It's the laws of the oral Torah. And then 300 years later, we have the Talmud. And that's it's the elaboration of the Mishnah. It's the filling out, so to speak, of the bookcase of the oral Torah now featured in writing. In that era, the era of the Mishnah and the Talmud, so think about from the year maybe 100 years before the Common Era to the year 500, 600 years of the Common Era, when we have the sages of the Talmud and the Mishnah, that era also produced enormous volumes of literature called Midrash. Now, the word Midrash means to have a darash, which means an exposition. To analyze something is to have a drash on it, to elaborate, to explicate some underlying literature. That's the term Midrash. But this is a whole body of literature. There's different types of Midrash, as we shall see. But there's a body of literature that comes from that same era, the era of the writing of the Mishnah and the Talmud. And the sages who wrote the Mishnah and the Talmud, they also wrote the works of the Midrash. This is just some background to understand what we're talking about when we talk about Midrash. And more specifically, the Midrash literature is always going to follow one of the books of the Tanakh. Meaning, you're going to have the book of Genesis, the first book of the Torah, and you'll have companion Midrashic literature on the book of Genesis. Similarly, you have the book of Exodus, and you'll have the Midrashic literature on the book of Exodus, and so on, Leviticus, Numbers, Devarim, Deuteronomy, and so on, and even the book of Joshua and Samuel, and so on. You'll have companion works of Midrash to almost all the other books, authored by the same great sages who brought us the Mishnah and the Talmud. Okay, I know this is confusing. We're going to make it even more confusing. Forgive me. Within the Midrash and the Midrashic literature, there's two types of Midrashic literature. One is called Midrash Halacha, the Midrash that focuses on matters of law. And then there's Midrash Agada, which focuses on non-law, non-legal parts of the Torah. You read the book of Genesis, and you're looking for mitzvos. Where are these laws, these 613 laws that you told me about? And it's very hard to find any in the book of Genesis. Lots of stories, very dramatic stories, wonderful personalities. It's thrilling, but where's the law? Torah's law, where's the law? And we know there's only 3 mitzvos in the whole book of Genesis. 3 mitzvos, that's it. So if you want to look at the corresponding book of Midrash on law, you won't find anything on Genesis, because there's very little law in Genesis. However, once you get to the next book, Exodus, it's lots and lots and lots of law. So you're going to find a book called Mechilta, which is the Midrash of the legal variety, the Midrash Halacha on the book of Exodus, and so on. There's a book Sifra, Sifri, Torah's Kohanim, and so on. There are companion Midrashic literature on the four final books of the Torah. When people colloquially say Midrash, they're almost always referring to the other type of Midrash, the non-halachic Midrash, not the ones that are only on the last 4 books of the Torah, but the ones that don't deal necessarily with halacha, and that you will find the Midrashic literature on the book of Genesis and Exodus and so on, the rest of them. That's what we want to focus on. The non-halachic Midrash literature on the Torah and really on the Tanakh, on most of the Tanakh. You open up this book and you'll find enormous, voluminous literature on the text of the Torah. And Joel, in his email, wants to know, what's the deal with the Midrash? Is it all literal? Is it all true? Is it prophetic? Where does it come from? What's the history? How do we know how to approach it? And that's a very good question. You open it, and it's hard to find exactly what is the common theme of the Midrash. Like, what is the content of the Midrash? A lot of it is stories. A lot of it is interpretations of the text of the Torah. It offers a lot of background. The stories of the Torah, it fills out the stories. It gives us the the prologues and the epilogues and the backstory and the subtext of the stories. It's ideas and themes, larger themes of general sections of the Torah. It has all sorts of stories. And some of the things are very strange sounding. So how are we supposed to understand what the Midrash is all about? Now, if you read the Torah and you want to understand it, everyone gives you the same advice. Everyone. The modern, contemporary people and the people of 1,000 years ago, everyone's saying the same thing. You want to understand the Torah? The first place you start with is you look at the commentary of Rashi. Everyone says that, even his contemporaries 1,000 years ago. If you read Rashi, and he gives interpretations of verses, almost every verse has an interpretation that you can actually trace back to the Midrash. So the Midrash is like a commentary on the Torah, and Rashi in his commentary on the Torah is going to select and curate certain teachings from the Midrash to incorporate and to assimilate into his commentary on the Torah. Now, a lot of what Rashi says does not come from the Midrash, but much of what Rashi does say does come from the Midrash. I'll give you some examples. In our Parsha, this week is Parshas Vayetze. Jacob has to flee. Esav wants to kill him because he usurped the blessings. He has to go, to flee. Where? To Haran, to go marry one of the daughters of Laban and to escape the wrath of Esav. So the Parsha starts Vayetze, and Jacob leaves. He leaves his home, Beersheba, in the land of Canaan, and he goes to Haran. But on the way, he stops. Vayivga b'makom. He encounters the place. What place? We don't know. But there's a general rule. Every time it says the place in the Torah, it's a reference to the place, meaning Jerusalem. And he goes to sleep there because it's nighttime. And he takes from the stones of the place, Vayikach me'avnei hamakom, and he puts it around his head, and he goes to sleep in that place. Seems like a very simple verse describing Jacob on his way to Haran. He's leaving Beersheba, going to Haran. He stops off in the place. We know that's Jerusalem. Every time it says the word the place is referring to Jerusalem in the Torah, Mount Moriah. And he put some stones around his head, some stones from that place. And he goes to sleep in that place. Now, to appreciate what's going to happen over here as we analyze this verse, you have to realize that there can't be a single letter that's extra. It can't be. So if I could have shortened this sentence and teach you everything that you need to know, it has to be that it will be shortened. Has to be. So you look at Rashi. Rashi has a lot of commentaries on this verse. But let's just analyze some of them and see how it comes from the Midrash and what he did with it. So Rashi, we'll just focus on a few of them. There's more here. The stones that Rashi takes from the place. So Rashi explains what he did. He made it like a semicircle around his head. Why is he taking stones? You need to go to sleep. Go to sleep. Why are there stones here? And place it around his head. What's happening over here? So Rashi says, well, he's scared. This is maybe some wild animals there. So he takes the stones and places them around his head so the animals won't attack him. Okay. If Rashi said that, stop there. It makes sense, it's telling us a story, apparently, of Jacob traveling, and he's in some place. He doesn't visit the hotel, a Marriott or something like that, a stop by. So he's worried. Maybe there's some wild animals. Let's put some stones to protect my head. Okay. Then Rashi continues. The stones started fighting one with the other, jostling and elbowing each other. This is the stones, okay? And each one is saying, Alaya niach tzadik rosho. Alaya niach tzadik rosho. Every stone wanted to be closest to Jacob's head, to be like a pillow for Jacob. And they start fighting. And right away, God takes the stone and makes it into one stone. And that's why, says Rashi, at the end of this whole section, It says that Jacob took the stone that he had used and poured oil in it, made it like a cornerstone, a foundation stone for the temple. So Rashi notes that you read the verses very carefully. It starts off that these are stones, avnei, stones. At the end, it's only one stone. What happened? There must be somehow between the time that Jacob went to sleep, has a dream with the angels and so on, and the time where he wakes up, those stones are now a stone. So Rashi says, quoting the Midrash, these stones started fighting with each other and God morphed them, merged them, fused them into one. Fascinating, interesting, dramatic. Okay, put that aside for a second. The end of the verse has some extra words. Vayishtav bamakom hahu. Jacob is on the way to Haran and he stops in a place. We don't know why he stops. We don't know what he did there necessarily, but he stops in a place. And now it's nighttime, and he wants to go to sleep, and therefore he places the stones around his head. Vayishkav, and he went to sleep. And then it adds two more words. Bamakom hahu, in that place. If the verse simply said Vayishkav and he went to sleep, I would know everything I need to know. We already know that he's in the place, and he goes to sleep because it's nighttime. So why did it say Vayishkav bamakom hahu, in that place? That's the question that Rashi ponders. And Rashi answers. When the Torah tells us this, it's this, and not that. That's a rule in the Torah. If it says this happened precisely here in this way, in this manner, it means it did not happen somewhere else in some other manner. So, says Rashi, Jacob is going to sleep and laying down, but during the 14 years that he spent in the academy, when he went to sleep, he didn't lay down. To lay down, you could sleep even without laying down. I've been on a plane. You walk into the plane, half the place is sleeping before you even get on the plane. I don't know how they do it, but they're sleeping and they're not laying down, unless you're in the first class, lie flat. So it's possible to sleep without laying down. Says Rashi, when the verse tells us that he lay down in this place, that's telling you, well, he lay down to sleep in this place. When he slept in some other place, he was not laying down. When he was in the academy of Shem and Ever studying Torah for 14 years, he didn't lay down to sleep. He would study Torah, and if he needed to sleep, he'd put his head down like on a chair or something like that. But it was not a permanent kind of laying down to go to sleep. Now, Rashi does not identify where he gets these teachings. This like, again, gives us more background to the story. There are all sorts of lessons as perhaps we can see from this. For example, the idea of Jacob's commitment to Torah study, where he's 14 years of study, but not even laying down and interrupting it by going to sleep. If he would sleep, it would just be a little bit here, a little bit there, to just refresh and re-energize and go back to study. That's a degree of dedication, 14 years of that. Can you imagine what that looks like? The stones, they're fighting. What does that mean? It means that in the proximity of Jacob, in his environs, stones become spiritual. That's what it's telling us. Jacob uplifts everything around him. If you're a stone, you're an inanimate piece of material. Suddenly, when Jacob's around, you want holiness, and you start jostling and fighting, and you're elevated to a different dimension of existence. That's a very powerful lesson. And Rashi tells us these, and as we shall see, it originates in the Midrash. Rashi doesn't point us to the Midrash, but if you open up the Midrash, on this verse, again, we have the accompanying Midrash, not the halachic Midrash. There's no halachic ramification to this story, as far as we know. There may be, actually, but it's not immediately obvious. It's not a halachic subject. The Midrash says, pointing out again, starts off as stones, ends off as a stone. They morphed together. But the Midrash offers all sorts of angles and insight that Rashi omits. For example, Jacob took stones. How many stones did he take? Rashi does not tell us. We know that he must have taken at least 2 stones, right? Because the word stones is a plural. It must be at least 2. But is it 2? Is it 3? Is it 12? Maybe? We don't know. Rashi doesn't opine on that. But the Midrash does. And it offers 3 opinions. Was it 2? Was it 3? Was it 12? Was it 2 symbolic of Abraham and Isaac before him? They had 2. They had one good, one bad, one good, one bad. But Jacob, no, everything morphs together. It's the one. There's only righteousness from Jacob. Or it was a 3 to symbolize this triumvirate of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and it morphs into one nation. Or was it 12 to symbolize the 12 tribes that Jacob is destined to father? And it brings proofs and analysis in each one of these different opinions. The 4th opinion doesn't talk about how many stones there were, but says that he placed the stones like a semicircle around his head to protect from wild animals. It seems like Rashi is curating, he's selecting that interpretation over the others. Why he did that? You have to understand his decision-making system to know why he chose that one over the others. But this is a classic example of a Midrash that appears in the most basic of commentaries, in the commentary of Rashi. And again, the next idea that we mentioned, Jacob sleeps in that place, but when he was elsewhere, he did not sleep. Where's this elsewhere? So Rashi tells us that's the 14 years that Jacob spent in the academy of Shem and Aver. You look at the Midrash. Midrash has the same observation, but it offers other opinions. Jacob worked for Laban for 20 years. And he was very dedicated in his work. And he wouldn't sleep, lay down flat for 20 years. Because he was the consummate employee. If I'm working for Laban, 24/7 I'm working for Laban. So he was always ready in case he was needed. He didn't lay down flat. So he laid down flat over here, not in the future. So we have a verse, and we have a commentary Rashi, and we have the Midrash offering some more angles of interpretation to this verse. We have the curation of Rashi. And again, we have Joel's question. What's the deal? Where does it come from? What's the way to understand Midrash? Now, there's another Midrashic commentary that Rashi omits entirely. Doesn't offer any hint to this other Midrash. When Jacob's there sleeping, he has a dream. And he sees a ladder. And the ladder has angels. Angels going up and angels going down. And then he has a revelation of God. And God says, I'm the God of Abraham, your father, your grandfather, and the God of Isaac. The land that you are laying upon, I'm going to give it to you. And your descendants will proliferate in all different directions. And they will be the bastion of blessing. All blessing will come from them. And I'll be with you and I'll guard you wherever you go and so on. A very wonderful blessing. I'm never going to depart from you. And Jacob wakes up and he's all terrified because he slept in this most sacrosanct of locations. This is the gateway to heaven. And he takes the stone, the single stone, and he makes it a monument and he pours oil on top of it. The angels going up and down. How far up? How far down? Which angels? What doesn't say? Like, we don't know what's happening over here. Rashi does offer a comment, but there's a Midrash that Rashi omits entirely. The Midrash says that these are the angels of various nations. Nations have angels. And there was one angel that was the angel of Babylon. and starts ascending the ladder in Jacob's dream. And it goes up rung after rung, 70 rungs. And then it comes down. And then the next angel, the angel who is the guardian angel of media, of Persian media, it starts to ascend. Goes up 52 rungs and comes back down. And the angel of the Greeks goes up 100 rungs and comes down. And then the fourth angel, the angel of Edom, starts to climb and climb and climb and climb. And it passes 100, it passes 1,000 runs. And Jacob is freaking out and terrified. What's going to be? Will this angel ever come down? And God tells Jacob not to worry. Don't worry, my servant Jacob. Don't be fearful, Israel. Even if you see this angel, the angel of Edom, ascending all the way up to heaven, all the way up to God himself, so to speak. Even if he's there, God promises, I'm going to make him tumble down. If this angel ascends like an eagle and perches its nest amongst the stars, from there I will take it down, says God. A very dramatic midrash. These angels, what are the angels? When are they going up? What are they going down? Symbolizing the 4 exiles, and each rung has a year of exile, and the angel of the Babylonians goes up 70, comes back down, because the exile will be 70 years, and that's it. And then Persia Media, 52, Greece, 100. And Edom just seems like it's endless. Jacob's fearful, and God says, don't worry about it. They too will have their comeuppance. This Rashi makes no mention of. So he chooses some midrash, he incorporates that into his commentary, and we have this other midrash, and it makes no appearance in Rashi's commentary. So where does it come from, the midrash? How are we to view midrash? Is everything true? Joel asks. Is everything literal? Joel asks. I've seen a midrash that says that Pharaoh was 1 cubit tall. Now, how much is a cubit? We don't know exactly, but it's between 18 and 24 inches. That's very short. Oh, and Moshe was 10 cubits tall. Oh, he's 20 feet tall. Oh, and then Moshe had a stick that was 10 cubits tall. Imagine a massive lumbering giant with a huge stick. Oh, and then Moshe jumped 10 cubits in the air. And Moshe smashed the ankle of Og. And that blow knocked Og and fell down and he died. So if Moshe is 10 amos tall, 10 cubits tall, and he's holding a stick, which is 10 amos tall, and he jumps 10 amos, that's 30 amos, that's 60 feet. And he reached the ankle of Og. Is that literal? Really? 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 Color me skeptical. It's very hard to accept that that is literal. But is it heresy? This comes from our sages. We believe that the written Torah and the oral Torah, they're both from God. And the Talmud says, if you reject the written Torah, that's heresy. If you reject the oral Torah, it's also heresy. When we believe in the veracity of the Torah, in the divinity of the Torah, we're believing both in the written Torah and the oral Torah. Someone says, well, I believe in the written Torah, not the oral Torah. That is heresy. What about Midrash? It's part of the oral Torah. It's authored by the sages who wrote the oral Torah. To believe in it, is that mandatory? Is that necessary? Must we believe it's all true? Must we believe it's all literal? These are some important questions. Now, thankfully, our sages addressed these questions. The Gaon of Vilna, in his commentary to Proverbs, chapter 24, verse 30, he talks about it. What's the purpose of Midrash? What's the purpose of Agada? which is the non-halachic corpus featured in the writings, in the literature. And he explains, if you think that the purpose of the Midrash, the non-halachic Midrash, is to tell you what happened, is to fill out the stories, is to give you the history, that's a big mistake. It's a big mistake. That's not what the purpose is. It may be that the Midrash does give us some of the backstory, but that's not the purpose of the Midrash. That's almost incidental. The purpose is to give us lessons, number one. Number two, the purpose is to convey secrets. Number three, the purpose is to help us understand Scripture. Now, if you zoom out this question even further, is everything in the Torah literal? That sounds like it's a dicier question. Is everything in the Torah literal? We have some very reputable sages whose name we say every day, and every class we mention them, who say that there are some parts of the Torah that are not literal. The word Torah means instruction. The Torah is always instructive. The Torah is always true. True does not mean literal. If that's true with the Torah, it's certainly true with the Midrash. I have not found anyone of the sages that says that all Midrash is literal. I haven't found a single one. In fact, they'll say the opposite. They are not necessarily literal. And in fact, the purpose is to tell us that the Gaon of Vilna says it's lessons, it's secrets, and it's interpretations of the verse. He doesn't say this is the literal account of what happened. I think, and the Rambam himself says it, so to me it's obviously a true statement. If someone believes that Moshe was 10 cubits tall and Pharaoh was 1 cubit tall, literally, if you measure them with the tape measure, to me that's a fool. That's a mark of a fool. Who doesn't understand that our sages use descriptions and coding and encrypted ideas to convey very deep lessons, and they say things that are outlandish because they're trying to mask. They're using devices. They're using devices to convey very, very deep ideas. Now, the most wonderful primer to Midrash, well, arguably the most wonderful and comprehensive and instructive primer to Midrash is featured by Ramchal. And he talks about the Midrash. And he says a very deep point. He says the Midrash and the Agadic, non-halachic Midrash, it's there to give us secrets. Part of it was secrets, lessons and secrets. How do you write secrets in a way that only the intended recipient will understand it? If I'm sending encrypted messages and I want the soldier on the battlefield, the general on the battlefield to hear it, but no one else to hear it, you have to encrypt it. What if they intercept the messages? There are secrets that our sages want to write down, but they want to encrypt it in a way that only the proper people understand it. To everyone else, it will sound like gibberish. That's the objective of this body of literature, says Ramchal. The secrets of the Torah, what he calls Ikrei Ha'eluhuyus, hard word to pronounce, godly principles, secrets, Kabbalistic ideas. You want to write it down. But if you just write it down, well then nefarious or deceptive charlatans may have access to it. There's tremendous danger in making the secrets of the Torah available to all. It's very deep. It could be very easily misinterpreted. And it can be perverted. So the sages had a problem. How do we write down something in a way that only the intended recipients will understand it? They had to thread the needle. They have to write it and couch it and mask it in a way that it will remain locked for all but the worthiest. And the means, the keys to interpret it were passed down from teacher to student. So we have literature that at least parts of it are secrets presented us in a way that we won't understand it unless we are worthy. And by the way, he adds that any scientific idea featured in the Talmud, in the Midrash, or any medicinal advice, don't say that the Talmud is teaching us science or medicine. No, that's not the purpose. This is a medium, this is a device to convey a very deep idea, and the sages would employ whatever scientific understanding was prevalent in their times, but the purpose of the Torah is to teach us lessons. It's not a storybook, it's not a history book, it's a book of lessons. The purpose of the Midrash is also to teach us lessons. Whether or not these are literal descriptions of events is irrelevant. The Rambam, in his introduction to the final chapter of the book of Mishnah of Sanhedrin, he says that when it comes to these parts of the literature, you have three types of students. You have the simpletons who believe everything that I say to say, we have to say it's true and literal. And they're not capable of imagining that the sages are way more advanced than they are. They understand things only in one dimension, and therefore they interpret everything only in one dimension. The Rambam calls them paupers of knowledge. They're fools, his words. They destroy the Torah because they explain everything as literal. And when someone else hears it, and it sounds outlandish, it sounds ridiculous, the others who hear it, they deride the Torah. People like this, it's better for them to be quiet as opposed to profess their expertise, because they're ruining Torah. Category 1. Category 2 is the people who also take everything literal, but they are a little bit more devious. They present the Torah or this sort of literature in a way that deliberately defames the sages. So they have a malignant intent. They want to slander the sages. And this group, this is the third group, they're the cursed ones. So if you take it literal, you can take it literal and say, well, this is true and it's literal, or you say it's false and it's literal. Either way, you're either a fool or a wicked person. And then there's the third group, and it's such a small group. It's like, how can you call it a group? It's like calling this the sun one of the stars. It's the only sun that we have, right? It's outrageous to say that this is just a star. There's only one of them. Similarly, there's so few people who get it right, it's hard to even call it a group. And they understand that the sages, with their titanic intellect, they're going to use metaphor. And what they write will have multiple dimensions of meaning. We'll have a revealed meaning, one level, and they'll have a hidden meaning on another level. And they'll use allegory and metaphor and parable and riddles. And they'll develop the sensitivity to understand what exactly is being professed by the sages. Only the third cohort should approach the Midrashic literature. The sages assume absolute competence, okay? Assume absolute intelligence. Assume abilities that you can't even fathom in your wildest imaginations. And these are the people that wrote that Moshe was 10 cubits tall. Really? You think that that's literal? That's absolutely foolish. The Midrash is a vehicle to convey very deep ideas, and they're couched in all sorts of unusual ways often. And while some of them are literal, some are not, and the sages will not help you, or maybe eventually they would, but you have to develop the taste and the sensitivity in the heart to know which one is which. Apparently, the Rama writes that he said he planned on writing an authoritative book, going through all the Midrash and saying literal, not literal, literal, not literal. Wouldn't that be a wonderful book? But we don't have that book. Apparently, he did not write that. Now, in the Guide to the Perplexed, the Rambam reiterates this point, that not all Midrashic and Aggadic literature is literal, and he cites a very compelling proof to this. The Talmud talks about the book of Job and the personage of Job. Who is Job? And there are a variety of opinions. And one opinion of the Talmud is that, well, Job never existed. The whole story is a metaphor to teach us the very important lessons of Job. It's all non-literal. Says the Rama, if we could take a whole book of Tanakh, one of the 24 books that our prophets gave us, and said that whole book is metaphorical and non-literal, certainly we have a Midrashic teaching, we can say that that too is non-literal. Now, how far do you go with this? How comfortable are we saying that something is a metaphor, an idea, a lesson, a subtle, nuanced lesson, and it's not something which is literal? So this appears in a very interesting place. In the run-up to Sinai, chapter 19 of Exodus, Moshe is doing some shuttle diplomacy between God and the nation. And in chapter 19, verse 13, God tells Moshe, no one should touch this mountain. During the revelation, you'll die. A person touches it, an animal touches it, will die. How do you know when the presence of God has departed, so to speak, from the mountain? When you hear the sound of the shofar. Then you can go up to the mountain. It's no longer sacred and dangerous. So Rashi, in his commentary, says, well, the sound of the shofar? Well, what shofar? What are you talking about? So Rashi tells us, oh, this is the sound, a specific sound of a shofar, of a horn, of an ayil, a ram. Okay. And then Rashi adds, well, which ram? It's the shofar of the ram of the binding of Isaac. Binding of Isaac. Isaac was supplanted with a ram, and it was thrashing about in the thistles, caught up in the brambles, and Abraham disentangles it, offers it as a sacrifice instead of Isaac. That same ram, that same horn, that's featured at Sinai. That's what Rashi says. Now the Ramban says, well, as he often does, he cites Rashi and says, wait a minute, doesn't make sense to me. Because the ram that Abraham offered as a sacrifice, that was an olah offering, an elevation offering. And the law of an elevation offering is that it all must be burned, including the horns. So, if so, the horns of this ram were also burned. So how are they available a couple of centuries later at Sinai? That's the Ramban's question. And he suggests an answer. He says, well, maybe God took the ashes of that, the burnt ashes of the horn from the binding, from the altar, and reconstituted it as a shofar, and that was the shofar that was blown at Sinai. Okay, that's obviously, this is a Midrash. Rashi is saying a Midrash, interpretation of a verse, and the Ramban is challenging it because literally we know that an olah offering must all be burned, and Abraham did an olah offering, so therefore the shofar is burnt. Well, maybe it was reconstituted. That's his answer. There is maybe the greatest of commentators on this sort of literature is the Maharal. And the Maharal offers a commentary on Rashi on the Torah. The Maharal is very prolific. He has a running commentary in all of Rashi and the Torah called Gurari, but also has a commentary on all of Talmud, and specifically the Midrashic, the Agadic parts of the Talmud. And he's like, Ramban's asking this question? As if the Ramban is assuming that the shofar that God, so to speak, is blowing, he needs a real shofar to blow? Really? Really? Does anyone really think that this 100-year-old or 300-year-old, it's more than that, right? What is it? It's almost 400-year-old shofar. Oh, where is it? Make sure you bring it. Don't forget it. Don't leave it up on Mount Moriah. God brought it back and blew the shofar. The shofar of the binding, it's a spiritual entity. It's a spiritual concept. It's a non-literal concept, and that force is being unleashed at Sinai. This merit of the Jewish people, this incredible event that happened on this mountaintop, is somehow being channeled, being invoked at the mountaintop event at Sinai. Why are we assuming that this Midrash must be literal? We don't have a single reputable opinion amongst the sages that says that Midrash must be literal. Not to say it's not true. There isn't a source that says that Midrash is just made up. Everyone agrees Midrash is true, and everyone agrees the Midrash is not necessarily literal. How do you know the difference? We don't have that book of the Rambam. We have to develop the taste. Now, the Ramban himself, he obviously agreed with this. But the Ramban is of the opinion that the only time that we can deploy a Midrash, of course, for the lessons contained within it, the only way we can do that is if it can also be interpreted on a literal level. If it can be interpreted on a literal level, not to say that it is literal, but it can be interpreted on a literal level, then we could use it to understand on a more metaphorical, homiletic level what the lesson of the sages is. But we're not going to use it in a commentary to the Torah if there's no way to interpret it on a literal level at all. And therefore he says, okay, so let's find a way to interpret it on a literal level. Not to say that is the interpretation, but that's a prerequisite for it to be an interpretation. And therefore he says, well, maybe it was reconstituted. God took all the ashes and melded it back. Not to say that God used the shofar or God even did that, but there is a way, there is the possibility of it being literal as well. And through that, once we have that literal, or the capacity for it to be literally true, only then, in that framework, can the non-literal interpretations be made. There's an enormous body of oral Torah. This is part of the oral Torah. The Maharal elsewhere says that just as we must believe in the written Torah as being divine, and we must believe in the oral Torah being divine, we also must believe in the Midrashic literature being divine. Not literal, but divine. The lessons, where the sages get these lessons, they didn't make them up, they didn't concoct them from their own imagination. These are part of the tradition that was passed, God to Moshe, Moshe to Joshua, and so on, Moshe to his generation. Joshua is responsible for perpetuating it to the next generation, and so on. And it was eventually couched in this way. These secrets, these lessons were couched in the Midrashic method of writing, of interpretation, but it is part of the true oral Torah given to us by the Almighty. And again, it's preserved and presented and perpetuated in a way that is encrypted. There's a mask to it. There's a facade to the message. It's encoded. It's illustrated sometimes in obscure terms. Is Midrash important or not? It's very important. It's a big mistake to think of Torah on only one dimension. It's part of the divine corpus of Torah. And yes, there's metaphor and there's different devices to package and to capture ideas, but the ideas are all mosaic that come from Sinai. And yes, the sages composed their own ways of framing it. They captured it with all sorts of parables and metaphors and homilies, but the substance is Sinaitic. If we want to develop ourselves not just be conforming with the legal parts of the Torah, the laws, the 613 laws of the Torah. We want to develop our character and our faith. The Midrash tells us the way to do that is with this whole other body of literature. The Gaon of Vilna famously writes that there's two types of Yetzer Hara, and there's two types of Torah, general types of the halachic and the non-halachic, and each part of the Torah corresponds to helping us fit a different part of the Yetzer Hara. But to do that, you have to develop a sensitivity. Just as we have a heart and a brain, the two parts of the Torah, two general methods of Torah, halachic and non-halachic, legal and non-legal. The legal part, we have to use our brain to understand it. The non-legal part, we have to use our heart, our sages tell us. The Torah is there to uplift all of us, not just our mind, but to make us dry and lacking vitality and verve and zest. It's not the goal. It's to elevate us entirely, the heart and the mind together. The purpose of that part, that section, that body of Torah is to penetrate our heart and elevate us and to make us enriched and not just to be dry, dull, legalistic, and formulaic. Now, often we'll find conflicting teachings in the Midrash. If you find conflicting teachings in the Talmud, in the halachic parts of the literature, you're in trouble. Because you have to find a way to resolve it. You must resolve it. When it comes to the Midrash, you don't have to resolve it. We don't have a dialectical way of studying it. There's subtleties and dimensions and realms that are different. And they could both be true in that modality. There are secrets and there are dimensions and there are realms that do not overlap with each other. So it's a whole different way of studying it. If you're coming from the legal perspective, you say, wait, I have this and I have that, and they're not the same. So I got a problem, I got to discard one of them. That is a true approach when it comes to studying the halachic parts of the oral Torah. When it comes to the non-halachic parts of the oral Torah, no, we're very comfortable with saying, well, we have a dispute. Was it 2 stones? Was it 3 stones? Was it 12? Which was it? To ask the question of how many stones there actually were there, it's missing the entirety of the story. It doesn't even matter how many stones there were there. That's not even what they're talking about. If you say that the argument is how many stones there were, you missed the entirety of the subject. What they're conveying is very deep ideas that go back to Moshe at Sinai. And thus, if you're imagining Jacob, however you imagine him, right? And like, well, one opinion says there was 2 physical stones there, and one says there were 3, and one says there were 12. You missed the entirety of the message. They're each conveying different nuances, different lessons, different ideas that can all be true. And it's totally irrelevant what actually happened. That's not the subject. It's a different subject. And that's why maybe this could be a bit maddening for people. Because we want to know, well, how many stones were there? That was never addressed. That's the point. It was never addressed. It's not at all part of the discussion in the sages in the Midrash. To do that, you really have to open up your heart. In many places, the Midrash is compared to wine. Wine is known to open up the heart, and sometimes with wine, I've been told, it could create paradoxes, and somehow that's able to work. There's paradoxes that it's like a dream, right? You have things that don't work out together, and when you're sentient, right? There's a different dimension. Wine brings you to a different dimension. Midrash is supposed to elevate you to a different dimension. You have to approach it with delicateness and sensitivity. And the discoveries are very subtle. My grandfather Bas Mem used to say that every midrash, every teaching of the Agadic literature is like a star. All you see is this one little faint dot. You have to make yourself into a telescope. You have to develop the tools and the sensitivity in the heart to know how to appreciate it and how to sense it and how to appreciate the beauty of the message. And it may take some work. But once you discover it, it can open up entirely a new world, a new approach in which we can live our life. So is Midrash true? Absolutely. Every Midrash is true. Is it literal? Not necessarily. Not to say that none of it's literal, but none of our sages tell us that every Midrash is literal. Not a single one. So we don't believe that the Midrash is necessarily literal. Is it prophecy? Joel asked in his email. Is it divinely inspired? I would say that it's part of the oral Torah. The lessons included in the Midrash are part of the oral Torah. And thus, the lessons are prophetic. Which ones are literal, which ones are not? Which ones are to be favored over the others? That's Rashi's job. Literally, his job is to say, I'm going to select from all the Midrashis, and he points us to the ones that he finds to be the best for us to focus on. Now, Rashi would not say that this is true compared to the other ones which are not true. He would never say that. But he has the ability and the credibility to do that. And that's why we focus very much on what Rashi says. Now, again, there's room for us to study Midrash on its own, because each one of them is true and has lessons, and so on. And yes, the Midrash is very helpful for us to understand the story of the Torah. The Torah does not mention that Eliezer was the servant in the chapter 24 of Genesis to go find a wife for Isaac. But it's accepted. If I want to know who was this person, to read the story, the text of the story, for whatever reason the Torah does not identify him by name, I'm very comfortable to say that this was literally Eliezer. I'm very comfortable with that. Tell me that Moshe was 10 cubits tall? No, that's not literal. Sorry, it's not. Are there some of them that are more gray area? Maybe we need the Rambam for that to know which ones are literal or not. But again, that's not even the point. The point of the Midrash, the Gaon says, is 3 points. Number 1, teach lessons. Number 2, to convey secrets. If you don't understand it, well, you're not worthy yet to understand those secrets. That's okay. It was specifically written so you couldn't understand it. And when you become worthy of understanding it, if you ever do, well, then you will understand it. And part of it is to interpret the Torah, to give us a commentary to help us understand the Torah better. Midrash is very rich. It's a wonderful corpus of Torah study. And maybe, just maybe, we'll actually do a more systematic study of Midrash. We'll put it definitely on the docket. I don't know. We have to find the right format for it. But certainly, it's worthy of our attention, and we should not belittle it or disregard it. It's part of the oral Torah tradition. The Maharal stresses that this is part of the divinity of the Torah. You believe in the Torah being divine. It's not just the legal parts of the Torah, the written Torah, the oral Torah, but also the non-legal parts and the lessons. They too come from Moshe, and thus they command our highest attention and sensitivity. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope I answered Joel's question. I'll send him the podcast. I'll say, Joel, we talked about it. We talked about it in the podcast. But if you have any comments, questions, or feedback, I welcome them. The email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com.